Hello, I'm Anna Delaney. Welcome to the ISNG studio here at RSAC Conference 2026. I'm very pleased to be joined by Neha Duggal. She is the product leader, advisor, and Danyi, CTO at P0 Security. Great to see you both.
Thank you for having us.
So the last time ISNG spoke with you was Gartner IAM Summit, and we discussed the evolution of privileged access management. Now we have the rise of non-human identities, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. How do we need to consider these new identities?
Non-human identities are fundamentally different from how human identities operate. And when you talk about a lot of privileged access management systems that were built, they're focused primarily on human identities. And non-human identities just don't behave that way. You don't see a non-human identity or a service account, which is an example of a non-human identity, log in or log out. The workflows are completely different. And now in the agentic era, where agents are being deployed, and we see this pattern of non-human identities fundamentally being used even within the agentic world to access your resources. The access patterns are now crazy all over the place. The problem is just multiplied, and it's just not similar to human identities. So as we look at non-human identities and as we look at agents specifically, and everyone's talking about AI here at RSA Security. So, at the event, it is important to think about access and fundamentally think of it as differently from human access because it is fundamentally different, but the problems are the same. So we still need to think about how do we solve these problems for these identities now that are operating at a massive scale.
Perfect. Greg, anything to add?
Yeah, I think one thing that stands out to me is that for service identities or non-human identities, they are a prime target for attackers. I think there was some evolution taking place where we've seen human identities compromised, and I think in the recent few years, we are seeing more and more non-human identity credentials compromised because they have the standing access and they have actually access to the most sensitive systems because they need to operate on them.
So we park the lack of visibility aside. How do you commonly see organizations mishandling these non-human identities, especially in the era of agentic AI? Greg, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So there are a few ways I think they are mishandled. So one of the things I think is important things is to differentiate between service identity and even agentic identity, because agentic identity is different from both of those. What are these differences? So let's compare it with a human identity, for example, first. If you take a human identity, the human will exercise a human type of judgment before taking actions, which you can't expect from an agent. I think there were some experiments that actually proved that agents are much more likely to take some very critical or dangerous action because they see they have the capability, while humans will, think twice in that case. If we look at service accounts, again, it's going to be different because service accounts operate with on a predefined pattern that the author of the service or the author of the code has created. Whereas for an agentic identity, they get a set of things they can do, and they will just pick what they believe is the best fit for the task. So that's why I think it's really important. Just like we have labeled service identities differently, we should label agentic identities differently as well.
Neha, any other missteps to add?
Yeah, the pattern that I think Greg was talking about, he's covered most of it. But fundamentally, what we're seeing is people are giving broad permissions to these agents because you want them to do whatever job you've defined for them quickly, which means they can't really wait for access. So you see over privileges in the system inherently that these agents have. And essentially, there's no tie back to even human identity or any identity whatsoever, for that matter, which makes it really complicated because there's no accountability, there's no auditability, and essentially no sense of control because they have keys to the kingdom.
Yeah. So where do you see the opportunity to right-size non-human identity access rights?
Yeah, this is fundamentally, some of the things that we've already talked about is one, there has to be accountability. So tying the agent or agentic identity and the access it has to some sort of identity, ideally, at least from a use case perspective, we see a lot of folks developing co-pilot and like a customer support agent like use cases. So tying it back to a human identity and privileges that it has, ideally it should be in an environment where agents don't have blanket access, but just enough just enough privileges they need just in time to do their jobs without adding much friction. That's fundamentally where you should start thinking about as these agents are getting deployed into production. You think about like how do you restrict that access from the get-go, so that's and you can control that from the get-go, as opposed to like, hey, we'll deploy it into production and then we'll rely on our ITDR products to tell us when something is wrong. I don't think that should be the approach. The approach should be going in, building that set of controls, to tie back.
Excellent. Greg, you've just recently announced general availability of your NHI lifecycle management and auths control plane for agents. So I'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah, so there are a couple of components of this. We would start with visibility, right? Because I think one of the challenges we've seen from some customers is that there are just a lot larger number of service identities than human identities. So if the first step is inventory these, understand what they do, understand who their owners are. So you can, if you need to make a change, you can't tell an NHI to make a change. You need a human to tell what change needs to be made. So start with that, understand what entitlements they have. And then after that, you can go into the operational aspect of it, which is for the life cycle of an NHI is going to be what entitlements it has, when does it get it revoked, and its credentials. So how long do the credentials live? How are they rotated? When are the credentials revoked? So revoking credentials, revoking entitlements, those are two different pieces of the life cycle.
So what's the practicality of this approach, Neha?
I mean, like I said, like if from a customer use case standpoint, every customer that I'm talking to at enterprise, are looking to build some of these co-pilot agents, customer support agents, whether that is simplifying the job of your SOC team that's trying to triage all of the alerts coming in, or it's your HR finance team that's developing agents. The practicality of this approach is that we want to fundamentally enable all of these customers to build these agents with confidence and deploy these agents with confidence and ensure that we can sort of enforce those just-in-time privileges and just enough privileges for these agents while not adding any friction whatsoever. So, agnostic of your agent architecture, being able to add that authorization layer that sort of assesses at runtime, at enforcement point, like what if an agent should be allowed to do a certain action or not, and making that happen. And again, we've seen wide applicability of that use case across every single customer that we've spoken to that's developed.
Do you have any specific use cases? I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, I mean the use cases that we were talking that I mentioned around SOC teams and like SOC teams triaging. So we see a lot of our enterprise customers that have SOC teams. Again, they're dealing with a lot of alerts. So they've built agents in place that tie back to some of their work times, like workbench tools that they have, other additional tools where they can sort of bring in. These agents are then sort of doing the work of not only sort of triaging some of these alerts in real time, but then going and sort of making changes on their behalf to any of their tools, other security tooling that they may have, and sort of alerting. So that end-to-end workflow. Or whether that's an HR and finance agent that, agents that are being built to either to serve payroll information or employee information to the different employees. So we're seeing a lot of these agents sort of being built, and, we're helping our customers sort of define guardrails so that, again, HR agent is not looking at data for employees other than the employee that's asking for that specific information, or the SOC team has the right permissions to talk to their endpoint tools or whatever else other security tooling in the platform.
Well, you've both spoken to non-human identities and agents quite comprehensively.
Yeah.
What about your other priorities this year, Greg?
Yeah, so I think we, when we look at the mission that we are on, right? We want to secure authorization. We want to become an authorization control plane for all sorts of identities, because at the end of the day, it's going to be what are the actions that these different identities can take in your system that is going to be the critical, preventive measure that you can take. And I actually really like this age that we live in now, because agentic has really put this in the foreground, where detection is going to be really late for some of these problems that you will encounter if it's happening at the machine speed suddenly that, hey, databases are being dropped or database writes are happening that shouldn't be happening. An alert by the time that fires up, by the time you action it, it's not going to be one isolated case. It's going to be spread, right? So it's much more important than it was before to ensure that there is least privilege and the correct entitlement. So as far as our roadmap is concerned, we're going to continue expanding our integration so we can cover more and more enterprise systems, and we can move them to a platform which is identity native, so we can attribute the actions to either the agent or the human identity clearly without indirections and without any kind of long lead credentials needed in this process.
Neha, anything to add? We just covered a lot of ground there.
Yeah, no, I mean, if I had to sum it, it's essentially getting our customers to a zero standing privilege or like least privilege model for all their identities, whether that's human, non-human, or agents. That's what we aspire to get. So any infrastructure tooling that is relevant to the enterprise space, sort of bringing that under the umbrella so you have control across your entire system is what we're aspiring to do this year.
Neha, Greg, thank you so much. This is absolutely brilliant. And I appreciate your time and insights.
Thank you for
Thank you so much. Yeah.
And thanks so much for watching. For IS&G, I'm Anna Delaney.